Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to take a look at some of the poll results to gauge the reaction of voters to the autumn budget statement last week. The Tories hoped that it would reverse their fortunes and allow them to narrow the gap enough to challenge for the election. Now, it's not done so. In fact, there's evidence that it hasn't really done them any good at all. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So the maddest thing I've heard about the timing of the election, because it's all really between, is it going to be next May or is it going to be next October, is that the Conservatives want to see if they can get the polling gap with Labour down to 10 points early next year in order to go for the May election and potentially engineer a hung parliament. Now, if that's true, if there's any of them actually thinking that, they've completely lost it. And when spring rolls around, they may end up panicking and waiting until autumn, making things even worse for themselves. I find it absolutely incredible that they think they can get themselves into a polling hole like they are now, like a serious level of unpopularity with the public, and just go, we're going to cut national insurance. And then that'll just change it all around, and people go, well, that's all you had to do. Yeah, we'll vote for you now. It's incredibly childish on some level, isn't it? You know, how did they imagine that a poll gap, which has been consistently at 20 points all year, would suddenly halve to 10 points in the next few months on the basis of this? It's not even a tax-cutting budget. You know, it's an autumn budget statement with a promise of tax cuts, but it doesn't actually do that. A couple of small problems with it, really. Like, the first thing is that polling consistently shows that what voters want are public services fixing rather than the taxes reducing. They're not opposed to reduced taxes. Of course, people want to pay less tax. But what they ultimately want more is the public services. Secondly, the overall rate of tax with this budget statement's increasing. And enough of the mainstream media outlets were reporting that, you know, for a lot of the public to realise. Also, as a little aside, some of us were wondering what happened to that cut to inheritance tax. You know, you think, well, because it didn't emerge, by the way. They didn't announce it. And you're thinking, was it just a rumour they allowed to circulate to string along the low tax brigade in the party so they didn't cause too much trouble before the statement itself? Thinking that, you know, they will like the overall statement. And they have, you know, a number of these low tax Tories were quite, positive about the budget statement, even though the overall rate of tax is going up, something they say they opposed. But according to some, the reason they didn't cut the inheritance tax or announce the cut to inheritance tax last week was because Labour's campaign against it seems to have got through to the public. So they've shelved the idea for now. Apparently they want to try and bring it back next spring, but that might depend on, again, how well Labour can turn the public against this tax cut for what is the top 4%. But theory aside, what was the impact on the public? In other words, what was the polling like? In terms of polls where the fieldwork was after the budget, don't get caught out by polls just because they were last week. If the fieldwork was before the 22nd, it has nothing to do with this budget. Well, looking at movements in the polls for a single event is quite fraught anyway, because, you know, you can have a party that goes up or down or something like that, and you link it to what you think was the main political issue of that week, but it could be other things. But let's give it a go anyway. So if you were a Conservative MP, you'd probably be quite pleased with the latest YouGov poll, because it showed a 4-point bounce for the Tories. And the fieldwork was the 22nd and 23rd. So that's the budget statement and the following day. So that's good then, yes? Not necessarily. So you have to look at the detail and the bigger picture. So first of all it's doing is putting the Conservatives back to where they were a month ago. You know, I said a month ago when they sort of dropped down quite a lot, it'll rebalance at some point. The gap between Labour and the Conservatives has been about 20 points all year. It will probably sort of stay there. So it's not an improvement on the Conservatives polling compared to a month ago even. It's exactly where it was a month ago. And it's exactly where it was at the start of the year in January. It just goes up and down. Polls fluctuate a bit. And you know, so this might have just been a rebalancing. It might have happened regardless. If there was no budget statement this week, may still have happened. The timing is interesting, but it's not conclusive. So then you look at, so where did this poll bounce come from? Did they nick a load of votes off Labour? Well, not really, no. Labour, first of all, didn't lose vote share at all, although it does look like the Conservative. So if you look at the number of in the last poll, the previous poll, the number of 2019 Conservative voters who said they were going to vote for Labour, that number went down a little bit in this poll. So you could say maybe they've got a few of their former voters back from Labour. But, you know, you look at the details, but the bulk of it seems to have come from a little bit from Reform UK from the previous week, and also a good chunk of those who voted Conservatives at the last election but weren't sure in the previous polls. So potentially winning a few undecided voters over, but not necessarily really taking significant number of votes back from Labour. Certainly not enough to affect Labour's share vote. And they'll need to do that. If they want to challenge in the election itself, it's not enough to try and sort of boost their own vote share up a little bit. They have to bring Labour's down. But Opinion had some interesting results as well. Another pollster, as reported in The Observer today, and they're the ones who commissioned it. Now, YouGov are probably slightly too kind to Labour than reality, mainly on account of their inflation of the Reform UK vote. Remember, the more votes Reform UK get, the more likely a Labour candidate is to beat a Conservative candidate in that seat. So if you have a weakness in your polling model that gives Reform UK a higher share of the vote than they're probably going to get, you sort of favour Labour a little bit. But that being said, actual results tend to be within their margin for error. So, you know, that's why I say YouGov and Ipsos Mori, I give those a big benefit of the doubt because, you know, they've come good in the last couple of elections. Opinion also inflate the Reform UK vote, but they also over-exaggerate the number of undecided... The number of voters in 2019 who voted Conservative, who now say they're undecided. What Opinion do with their model is to say, right, well, we think this many of them are actually going to vote Tory. They'll hold their nose on the election day and just vote Tory. So, and I think they exaggerate it a bit. So their poll results tend to flatter the Tories. And their latest poll actually showed the Conservatives losing vote share. But again, do note that the vote share they give the Tories is higher than most pollsters give them. And certainly higher than it really is. You know, you can sometimes get into a bit of a mess looking at changes to vote share in polls in any given week, because some pollsters have a party gaining vote share, some losing it. Look at what the overall values are. But they nonetheless have Labour gaining 2 points and the Tories losing a point since the budget statement. And there was also a bit of detail to their poll as well. They noted that 23% of people thought the statement was good. You know, they liked the budget statement. But 23% is less than the Tory vote share. So that could easily just be the committed Tory voters, which doesn't really, because they were the ones who were going to vote for them anyway. 27% thought it was bad. So that's a bit more. Thought it was bad than good. And about half just didn't know. Now, as is often the case, my respect for those who say they don't know. Most people aren't going to read a lot of independent economic analysis on budget statements. So most people, if we're honest, way more than half, don't really know what a budget means, because the media messaging is always full of spin. So I applaud people for recognising that actually they don't know until they see the budget implemented themselves. And when it is implemented, it's not going to be welcome. The reason Hunt is threatening to introduce the national insurance cut for January is because he wants to be able to say to people, your take-home pay has gone up now, hasn't it? In February, he wants to say, if you compare your wage slip from February compared to January, it's gone up, hasn't it? And people will have to say, well, yes, it has. But with energy prices going up in January, I'm not sure how many people will actually notice an improvement in their household budgets, even for a few months, because they certainly won't when the budget is fully implemented, because millions of target voters will see their take-home pay going down with the effective increase in income tax. You know, one reason why an autumn election would be madness for them is because people, once that budget's implemented, people are going to see it. But also, if we can stomach an extra half a year of the Tories, maybe even vaguely hilarious. Imagine the scenario. So you look at the polling results in May. Let's say they're going for autumn, right? We're not going to have a May election. So you look at the polling results in May and all the Tories are going, oh, just as well we didn't go for the polls in May. This has been crushing. Then they have the election at the end of October and it's way worse. It'll be fair to say that whoever takes over as Tory leader will sack the entire strategy team. Opinion have also suggested that Jeremy Hunt has a net approval rating of -15 as Chancellor, with Rachel Reeves, his opposite number in Labour, on +1. The only good news in the opinion poll for the Tories was that Labour's lead on the economy has come down, but it still showed that Labour have more voters thinking they can manage the economy better than the Conservatives. And that's a key metric. You know, sometimes when people are trying to say, well, let's not get carried away with the polls, don't you remember Ed Miliband's Labour had a poll lead over Cameron's Tories, albeit brief. It's worth noting Labour never led on the economy. And Miliband never led Cameron on the head-to-head. And those are the details which can make a poll lead soft. Polling consistently shows Labour now ahead on the economy and Starmer ahead against Sunak. It's also helpful that Reeves is well ahead against Hunt, though Sunak can at least sack Hunt at some strategic moment if he needs to. In terms of YouGov's specific polling on the budget, that was a bit of a more of a mixed bag. Many of the headline features were popular, as you would expect, because the headline features are, we're going to cut this tax, we're going to raise, the pension, we're going to raise the, minimum wage. They're, of course, going to be popular. And the poll didn't really ask about some of the things they weren't doing, like money for schools and hospitals that keep falling down. But more people thought the budget would leave the country worse off than better off. About half thought it would make no difference, though. Slightly more felt it would improve their personal household budget than make it worse. But again, over half said it would make no difference. And this last one, it might sound all right until you realise that if the Tories do go along with the election, people will have experienced it for themselves and realise that actually, no, our household budget is no better off. And despite some rumours that Tory strategists think that an autumn election might at least see some improvements in people's finances, I have to say all the independent economic analysis that I've seen suggests the opposite, that things are going to be worse in 2024 and they're going to carry on getting worse and people will feel the worse. I'd almost be tempted to suggest that all of these spurious arguments for an autumn election are a desperate attempt to wrong-foot Labour. I'd find it more credible to believe that the Tories might aim for an autumn election, because I can see it, I don't rule it out. But I'd find it more credible to believe that they might be thinking of that, as so many journalists do, if they came up with a credible strategic reason for doing so. Saying, we think the economy will be better next autumn. Economists don't think that. They think the opposite. The Bank of England thinks the opposite. But in the meantime, the budget statement did not help the Tories with the public, though it may have quelled the low tax rebels, even though it's a budget with a higher rate of tax. It's really quite mad. These low tax rebels say, we're not going to vote for a budget that raises the rate of tax. Jeremy Hunt says, I'm going to raise the rate of tax, but I'm going to cut a couple of taxes just for the headlines. And they go, that's brilliant. That's all we wanted. But nobody ever accused them of making sense, did they? But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.